Stephanie Jones, please.
Oh, I didn't turn it on. Okay. So we thought maybe there was little connection between these two, but I think that there's a lot of, not overlap, but a lot of connection between our two talks. Let's see if you think that as well. I will introduce myself briefly, and I sometimes like to stand up, so I'm going to get up and down probably, which means you might not be able to hear me. Do I have to care? It's fine. So I am a developmental psychologist by training, which means that I study social, emotional, and behavioral development and focus specifically on the links between exposure to adversity and developmental trajectories of children in those domains, the social, emotional, and behavioral domains. My work in the lab I run, which is called the EASL lab, and it's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the work that we do is really fundamentally about linking what we know from the science of human development in context to what we then do in educational settings. So I'm a developmental psychologist who works in education on these types of things, social, emotional, and behavioral development. And in our lab, we really do three kinds of studies or three bodies of work. One body of work is really about doing long-term developmental science. So we follow samples of children and families and sometimes teachers over very long periods of time. We also design interventions. So we make interventions and we implement them in schools, preschools, primary schools, higher education, and then we study them. So we randomize schools or classrooms to conditions, we implement something, and then we study those who are exposed over long periods of time. The third category is really what we describe as sort of building and communicating with the field. So we try to distill information and share it through different kinds of reports so that others can learn more about this field and access the science. So today, I'm not going to talk about a specific study. I'm going to give a kind of high-level overview of this field. And the reason that I'm doing that is because the world of education, the world of public policy, definitely in the US, but increasingly in other parts of the world, is very interested in this area. And some think that focusing on soft skills or non-cognitive skills or social and emotional skills is kind of the new answer in education. It is a way to solve the problems that we face, certainly in the US, with achievement gaps of different types, that this might be the pathway through that problem. And I'm not sure that that is true. I'm not sure that that's actually the answer, but it's certainly one way to begin to work on a problem like that. So with that in mind, I think I have about 35 minutes, which means that I'm going to talk relatively quickly because I always bring too many slides, which is my own self-regulation problem. I love to make the slides. So forgive me, and if I go too long, I'll just stop, and then we can talk about it later. And I'm happy to share the slides with anybody who wants them. So I thought I would say something very quickly about the discipline that underlies a lot of the work that developmental psychologists do in education, which is called prevention science. Then I would go into this big, broad overview of the field of social, emotional, and behavioral development, which is really sort of highlighting key aspects of the science that sits behind the practice and drives a lot of interest at different levels in this area. Then I'm going to talk about the practice, which is like, what do we know is effective in preschools, in schools, and other settings to build this body of skills. I'm going to talk about one innovation that we're working on in our lab to sort of rethink how the work happens, and then I'll highlight some frontiers. So we'll see if we can get through that in 35 minutes. So the background is really prevention science, and prevention science as a discipline, it began largely in the worlds of mental health and clinical practice, so preventing the onset of major disorder and dysfunction. It's changed over time and is increasingly applied to education. And it's really about connecting evidence and science to practice, and then using practice through experiments and trials in the real world. So the real life of human people, there's one connection between us, to build the knowledge base. So if we understand or we think we understand something, and then we try and manipulate it in the real world, we've really tested our theory, right? Our basic understanding, and in so doing, we contribute to the evidence base. And so all of the work that we do in the EASL lab is really about this cycle, and hopefully you'll see some of that as I go through. So here is the whirlwind about the science. And this is really a summary of 2 to 3 decades of research in this field in just a few slides. So forgive me if it's very synthetic. There's lots of evidence like this to sit behind this. So the first part of the science is really to say, what is social and emotional learning? And it's in its most basic sense, it's about these 4 things. So the first thing at the top in the blue is really about how thinking is managed, right? How thinking and attention is focused and deployed and shifted. It's about managing behavior, right? Which is me sitting here and preventing myself from jumping up and throwing my hands up, because that would seem weird in front of all of you watching this presentation. So I have to manage my behavior in this setting. It's about having and building positive relationships, and it's about feelings. So sometimes in this field, there's a lot of interest in one of these areas or another. And so there's a great deal of interest in emotions, but it's not just about emotions. There's also a great deal of interest in certain features of the thinking part, like perseverance or conscientiousness. But it's not just about that. It's about all of these together. And if you imagine, if you take your head and you put yourself inside the head, the brain, and the body of a learner. So take a 10-year-old and put them in the chair in the classroom and think about what they need to do to access what the teacher is teaching them. They need to focus their thinking. They need to prevent themselves from pushing the child who's sitting too close to them. They need to be able to have a positive relationship with their teacher, and they need to be able to manage positive and negative emotions. So they need to bring down their excitement when they have to, and they need to amp up their energy when they have to, and they have to manage things like frustration. So that's all central to learning. You could replace learn in this slide with the workplace, and these would still be true. These are all features that are essential to a productive and effective workforce, and economists are telling us that the future labor market is really about this, about being successful in these areas. So the challenge is that these are basic ideas, and the way the field talks about this stuff is in all different ways. So here is a set of headlines from the US, like magazines, newspaper articles over the last 5 years, and you see everything in here. You see words like traits, you see emotional intelligence, you see social intelligence, you see social and emotional learning, you see focus, you see sort of psychological traits. Everything is in there, and it's very hard to distill the information in order to get concrete and specific about what's important. So in our lab, because we design interventions, we're very focused on being specific and concrete about what's important. And so we actually organize this field into 6 major categories. And I apologize, 6 seems like a lot, but it is really what's represented in the literature. So we talk about 6 things. We have on the one hand skills and competencies, and skills and competencies are basically what you know about and what you know how to do, what you can show another that you can do. And these fall into 3 categories: a cognitive category, an emotion category, and a social category. And when you look closely, you probably can't see these at all. But when you look really closely, I can barely see them because I usually wear glasses. But if you get close, what you see in the cognitive domain are things like those core executive functions, which have to do with like managing and deploying attention, More sophisticated versions of that are setting goals and making plans to achieve them. Critical thinking. Some say creativity sits there. Oh, you can't hear me. Sorry. I'll stay. I will manage my behavior and stay here. Okay. In the emotion domain, you have things like emotion knowledge. Do you know about emotions? Can you discern and understand the emotions of others? Can you read them? And then do you express your emotions in ways that are appropriate to the situation? We also have more complex skills there, like empathy. So can you understand the emotions of others based on your own experience and share their experience? In the social domain, we have things like reading and understanding social cues. And this is really about looking at another and reading the social cues they're sending, right? So understanding the social environment. Social perspective taking, leaping into the shoes of another and understanding their perspective. Social problem solving, solving conflicts, cooperation, all of those sophisticated social skills. That is not all. There's another set. And this is really about beliefs and attitudes. And I have a colleague who's very focused on this area, and his way of thinking about it is you can have the skill, you can have the competence, but you might not use it in situations where you have to. You have to have a set of beliefs that using that skill will be effective. You have to have a set of values that say this is important to do. And you might have to have a personality characteristic, although I don't believe in that, I'm sorry to say, that will guide you to action. And so in this category, we have these kinds of things. We have beliefs, knowledge of self, and identity, and this is like self-efficacy. There's a lot of work on growth mindset. That's where this fits. Self-knowledge, purpose. In the character category, we have ethical, performance, intellectual, and civic values. And then in the personality category, we have things like optimism, gratitude, openness. We have some other crazy terms that people use like zest. So the reason that all of these categories are up here is that they appear in the literature. This is what people are studying. This is how they're describing this phenomena. I would say that if you leap into the practice literature, so what do people do and study in schools, it's really all of the skills and competencies. It's not as much the beliefs and attitudes. They're just less work trying to understand if you can manipulate and build and grow those skills. I would say one exception there is growth mindset. Everybody is interested in that, and they're studying it now. Okay, so I'm a developmentalist. I always talk about development and so what comes first and is the basis for skills that come next and is the basis precisely target their efforts in schools in one place or another. Because what we've discerned is that you have in the sort of first period of development that intersects with school, core cognitive skills like executive function emerge as the prefrontal cortex extends. Basic emotions emerge. This is the opportunity to build those skills and basic social engagement. What this means is that spending a lot of time with a 4-year-old trying to get them to be a sophisticated social problem solver or someone who is going to persevere doggedly is a good way to spend your time. What's important to do with a child that age is to really build these basic skills. They set the stage for what comes next, which is around 2nd or 3rd grade. This is 7 to 8-year-olds into 10 or 11. And at this period, more complex versions of those core cognitive, emotion, and social skills emerge. So we have in the cognitive column, we have things like planning and organizing and setting goals. In American schools, 3rd graders who are 8 or 9 have to be in charge of their own backpack. That means that they have to remember what goes in it. They have to remember to take it out and organize it. And they have to remember to put it all back in and bring it to school. That's about planning. And that's a key skill for that age. It's very hard to plan and set goals like that if you don't have some level of focused attention or working memory. You need those things to be able to do that more sophisticated cognitive skill. Empathy and perspective taking in the middle column for emotions. It's very hard to take the perspective of another, to have emotions, to share their emotions if you don't have an emotional repertoire. You have to learn about emotions to do that. And then understanding social cues cannot happen without social experience. And then finally, they all build to more sophisticated versions of problem solving. So we really wouldn't expect a young child to be able to solve a social conflict. We shouldn't. That's a waste of time. We have to build the skills over these developmental periods. Okay, so what do we know about this whole body of skills? We have probably 3 or 4 very solid pieces of evidence. One piece of evidence is long-term correlational studies. There's a handful of these, and what they have shown is that if you measure something like self-control or social competence in early childhood at the age of 4 and 5, and if you follow the sample for 20 to 30 years, you see that skills at ages 4 and 5 are linked correlationally, not causally, but 20 to 30 years later with key life outcomes that we care about. So it's not just academic achievement, it's a whole variety of things. This is a summary of those basic studies, which is that things like social competence, self-control, measured in early childhood, are associated with having a job in the future, 20 to 30 years later, being engaged in higher education and persisting through it, being physically healthy, not using substances overly, having some personal savings, and not being involved in the criminal justice system. What's interesting about these studies is that these basic associations are over and above IQ and other indicators of academic progress, as well as sociodemographic indicators. So, one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence are a vast number of large-scale evaluations or trials of interventions that are implemented in preschools or schools or elementary schools or in secondary schools. And these studies, if you look across them, basically tell us what we can expect from interventions that are implemented like they are in these studies. And what they show, if you look across them through meta-analytic work, you see that these kinds of interventions generate impacts in the social, emotional, and behavioral domains, which we should expect. But they also generate impacts in the academic domain. So even in areas that are not directly targeted by interventions, we see a boost in those areas as well. There's also interesting variation by key groups, which I'm going to give you an example of in just a second, and there's impacts at the level of the teacher, meaning on teacher practices, and some impacts at the level of the school. So this is just a summary of the studies that sit behind that. There's a meta-analysis that I think is, in some sense, responsible for much of the interest in this area. It came out in 2011. Some people think it's not a very good one, but never mind. So in that study, they basically show that there are impacts in the social and emotional domain of about half a standard deviation, more or less, and that there are these carryover impacts in areas like academic performance that are about a third of a standard deviation. This work has been confirmed in other studies that have happened more recently, and they generally report the same pattern. They also report that the effects observed in the original studies sustain for about 3.5 years. This is an example of some of the key variation in outcomes. This is from a trial that we did of a program, like all of these other ones, called the 4 R's: reading, writing, respect, and resolution. We did a trial of this program in elementary schools in New York City. We randomized schools and we followed children from 3rd to 9th grade, essentially 2 times each year with surveys and those kinds of things. And we did find, in general, average effects of the program on kids' outcomes. We did not observe average effects of the program on their academic outcomes, but we did see that for children identified at the baseline, at the outset of the study, as having the most difficulty with behavior. These are the kids who tend to be expelled or suspended from their school. For these kids, the effects of the program on their academic work were dramatic, about half of a standard deviation. For these kids who really struggle the most, an intervention in social and emotional learning served to boost their academic outcomes, so their reading and math standardized test scores. And one reason for this is that they were attending school more than their counterparts in the control schools. There was something about the intervention that was creating a culture and a climate in the school that allowed these most difficult kids to be there more. And so they accessed the learning environment more and they did better. There are also pretty consistent and substantial effects at the classroom level on teacher practices. So the kinds of things that teachers do in the classroom that are positive, so positive climate, fewer negative actions on the part of teachers, and then more effective management of behavior. This finding that's up here is repeated across many different studies. It's very consistent and the effect sizes tend to be the same. One reason for that is because everybody uses the same tool. So we see when we use the same measure, we see very consistent findings across studies. One of the challenges in this field is that sometimes the findings can appear inconsistent, and that's because everybody uses different tools, which is a problem I'll come to in a minute. Then finally, we have this new science from cognitive and behavioral neuroscience about the role of stress on the brain and on behavior. And I won't go into it in detail, but it's basically about identifying different types of stress. From one end of the spectrum, which is tolerable stress, that's stress of standing up in front of people you don't know and talking about stuff with complicated and too many slides. That's tolerable because everybody is friendly. From tolerable, that's growth promoting, to toxic, which is growth inhibiting. Toxic stress is repeated exposure to traumatic experiences or low grade levels of stress, but in a chronic, everyday way. And what we've learned from neuroscience is that those forms of stress in particular impact profoundly how the brain responds to stress as well as stress-like everyday events, and that cascades into negative behavior. This is especially important for this field because it tells a story and helps us understand better why we see some of the negative behavior we see in schools, but it also tells us that focusing in this area specifically is a pathway to change, right? So it's a way to interrupt the stress brain behavior cycle. Okay, that's the science. To the practice. This is a guide that our group developed. It's a synthesis and distillation of 25 research-supported, I'm going to say that generally because they're not all randomized trials that support these programs. In any case, it's a synthesis of 25 SEL programs, most of them originating in the US and deployed in the US, although some around the world. And from this, the work of doing this guide, we identified sort of the common elements of effective practice. So when you see a program and it has been studied, what is effective about it, and is there something common about that across effective programs? The guide is free online. It's 400 pages, so don't print it. Just look at it online. So what we learned is that effective practice in this area, so stuff that's effective in preschools, in schools, in high schools, in middle schools, is really two things. It's about having a safe and caring learning environment. So the culture and climate and the norms of the place are safe and supportive, and there is effective classroom management, meaning adults in the setting are not yelling and screaming at kids, and they're not suspending and expelling them. They're using effective forms of behavior management. And then, no surprise here, teaching these skills explicitly. These are, of course, completely related to each other, so the best instruction will not work in a place where adults are treating kids poorly and where they don't feel that they belong or feel that they are safe. By the same token, I'm not sure that just a safe and belonging environment is enough to build the kinds of skills you were talking about and that I'm talking about. When you look at the instructional part and you distill what's effective and common across these, it's really 3 or 4 things. It's that teachers are supported to model and live the behavior that they expect children to see. So what we've seen in schools is teachers say to us, "We love your program. It's so wonderful. It's just perfect. These children need emotional support so badly." And then you say, "Okay, great, goodbye," and you turn around and they yell at a whole bunch of children. So teacher and the children know that that is a lie. They see it and they know that it's not true of the adults in their environment. So adults modeling the behavior is critical, and we can talk about specific practices to do that. Adults need to teach the skills explicitly. So we often use words with young children and old children that they don't understand. So for example, I say to my son, since he was a very small child and still to this day, "Please pay attention. Can you please just listen to me and pay attention to what I'm saying?" And usually I'm irritable and exasperated. In the beginning, I realized he didn't know what the word attention meant, right? I never taught him. Attention means this. In your brain and in your body, it feels like this. And you can show me you're paying attention by doing this. So we need to teach it directly. There are lots of words, especially in this area, that are obscure to young children and old children, and we don't take the time to teach them. So we have to teach. There are lots of ways of doing that. And then finally, this domain is about practicing, right? So not everybody is good at shifting their attention right away. It takes practice. I have to learn self-control every day again. So it takes lots of opportunities to practice and have a language of social and emotional skills in the setting. So our focus in our work has really been to say, what is the way that most people do this work in schools? And most of the time in the US, what people do is they adopt a program or a curriculum. And those are the ones they adopt, right? There are a large number of them, but there are a small number that are adopted very frequently in schools. What's challenging about these is that they're complicated to do and they take a lot of time and support. And typically they're viewed as extra to the standard instructional practice of the school. Our view is that we would be more effective, we'd have more impactful work if we took a different approach and said, what are the strategies that are common across all of these programs? And if we designed strategies, then schools would adopt strategies and weave them into their practice, and they would do the work more consistently and more frequently. So our approach is to say, could we look across all of these evidence-based or research-supported programs and identify their common elements, and then create those and study them in practice? And so we call that kernels. We think that they are more effective because they're precise and targeted, they're flexible, they're easy to do, and to integrate into practice. We're doing a lot of projects to identify and share these kernels. Our earliest one was focused on executive function and self-regulation. So our precise target was the set of executive functions that underlie regulated behavior in the classroom. And we created a set of games that can be played in 5 minutes at any time of day in any setting that are specific to building these particular skills, and we designed them and redesigned them over time and then studied them in a trial last year. And we've been doing them all over the world. You don't need to know about that. So in our most recent trial of these brain games, we found that they impacted the brain game students in the classrooms assigned to do this intervention. Those students showed changes in their core executive functions using multiple measures over the course of a year. And so we found that for a measure of a direct assessment of global EF, which is the trail-making task, an effect size of about 0.4, which is not insubstantial. We also see shifts in attention and focused attention and low impulsive behavior from an observer rating, and then we have teachers rate children's skills, and we see shifts in their regulation, we call it regulation-related skills, and their prosocial behavior. So there is some evidence that just doing a bite-sized intervention that is very precisely targeted on a specific skill generates impacts of the same size, if not larger, than those generated by bigger, more complicated programs, which is one of our theories, that you will generate the same type of effects, but it'll be easier to do and less costly. So we're doing a larger project, oddly enough, funded by Facebook, but it is not on Facebook, but Facebook maybe would like it to be part of Facebook in the future, which we are not planning to do. But they have a big foundation, as it turns out, and a whole lot of money. So they are supporting this project to create a kind of kernelized approach to social emotional learning. And the way we are deriving our kernels is because we coded these 25 programs, and we are using our database. We did a detailed content analysis of all of the programs, 25 programs, and we are looking inside them to identify the common elements. So for example, in our database, we can search a code for emotion regulation. And all of the strategies in all of these programs that were coded as targeting emotion regulation appear. And so in looking at all of those, we've probably distilled 400 different types of strategies into a common set that are of about 7. So we're creating those and then doing a trial, testing them next year. Perfect timing. And that's what they look like. They're very simple to do. They're on cards. So in terms of the frontiers, I just want to mention a few things that are critical to sustaining the work of this field. And so if you're interested in social and emotional learning, these are the things you have to do. Okay, the first is figure out what I call the lexicon, so just to sort out this terminology. The second is to reshift the focus a little bit. And the third is to address assessment and evaluation. These are all huge tasks, but they must be addressed. So the first is this issue of the lexicon. As I alluded to in the very beginning, this field is referred to in a million different ways. It's very complicated to navigate what people mean by the terms that they use. Sometimes people use the same word to refer to very different things with different meanings, and sometimes they use different words to refer to the same thing. And that makes it very hard to use the science to think about what to do and then what to measure. And so most of this challenge comes from the proliferation of frameworks to sort of define what's important. And our view is that the answer is not to unify the frameworks, but instead figure out a way to connect them to each other. So those who employ a particular viewpoint or have a way of thinking and talking about this field can communicate effectively with those who talk about it a different way. And so I can just give you 1,000 examples of this from different literatures. I won't do that. What we did is we coded the frameworks in the same way that we coded the programs, and we created a website that is called Explore SEL. It is available to the world, that allows a user to compare and look inside frameworks and then understand terminology. So it has a set of tools that allow a direct comparison of frameworks, but also a thesaurus that allows one to look at specific terms and see how they're coded and what they're related to in other frameworks. The second frontier is really the focus. So we've spent most of our time, and I have spent most of my time, talking today about skills and competencies of children and youth. The truth is that to be effective, we really need to target adults, so adult skills and competencies, and conditions for learning, so the ways that places work and what happens in them that affects the kids in them. And I'm not certain, but I think maybe that if we had the design and the tools to allow us to do a head-to-head comparison of a focus on adults, shifting adult skills and competencies compared to the focusing just on children, that we would see if we could build the skills in adults, it would be way more effective in the short and long term than the work that we spend, the time that we spend working with kids directly. So adults, if they change, they create the conditions for children. So if we can support them, we can make a bigger difference for them and for the kids they serve. I think. I'm not sure. So what's related to this is this notion that that we tend to focus our work on what we define as structures. So do we have a curriculum? Do we have an assessment tool? Instead of on the key processes that those things are supposed to generate. So in many schools in the US, there is vast interest in social emotional learning, and the choice is we'll get a curriculum, and the box is checked, and then the curriculum sits in the classroom on a shelf. But everybody thinks they're doing social and emotional learning. The key to drive into outcomes is to ensure that the use of the curriculum, which is just a structure, changes the nature of the interactions, the sort of intangible processes that happen in a setting. So we need to focus on process, not just structures. And then finally, the third frontier, and probably the one that is of most interest to folks and the most complicated to solve, is one of assessment and evaluation. And this is captivating to policymakers in the US who want to measure in a large-scale way the skills and competencies of the population, but also to consider holding teachers accountable in their practice to moving the needle on these skills. And our view, this is from a report that we did on executive function about measures specifically, is that if you really want to be precise and deploy measurement in a way that's useful, you need to think about 4 basic questions, starting on one side with skill complexity. What is the skill itself? Like, is it a simple or complex skill? What is the key developmental domain of the skill? What is the age or developmental stage of the participant in question, of the person whose skills you want to measure? And what's the key context? And then given all of those things, what's the best measurement strategy? Unfortunately, the field of measurement and evaluation in this domain, and maybe in others as well, is not up to this task. And so we tend to rely on what we have, and we accommodate, which is partly why the science is still somewhat ambiguous. Circling back to the beginning, going back to this cycle that drives all of our work, I would say I have 4 recommendations. One is be transparent and precise in the terminology and the language. I would say in the strategies and programs area, build and test new approaches, but approaches that address context, adults, and children. And then think about how to specifically align measures with both development and context and a specific skill target, and think about how to measure settings. And that's all. Thank you. You can email me, and I'm happy to send you the slides. Okay. Questions?
Yes, questions.
First of all, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. And I really liked how you approached that emotional and cognitive and social unity, which you actually did first theoretically and then sharing the practical implementation. And my question is related to the unity of those 3 factors, which is probably you've heard of it. And this is a phenomenon of переживание. This is a Russian word introduced by Vygotsky, which actually unites all of them 3. And Vygotsky suggested to use it as a unit of analysis, first of conscience and then of development. So my question is, and as you said, there is a huge lexical disagreement between in the field in different. So I'm just bringing one more thing to discuss. But actually, for me, переживание is quite useful notion to analyze the developmental processes. So my question is, have you heard of it? And if you have, how you are using it, or probably thinking?
So I probably would have to honestly say I haven't heard of the word that you just used, but Vygotsky is a sort of a foundational influence on this field, definitely, and I think is why when we get to our conceptualization, we think about the cognitive and the affective and the social in tandem. There's much that's artificial about separating them. And we have to separate them in order to communicate about them sometimes, especially when we're talking with those who do the work in practice. It's much easier if we simplify it. Sure. And if we think about some of the kind of developmental, what I would like to describe as sort of developmental pinpointing, we tend to separate them in order to talk about stage salient developmental skills, meaning what's emerging developmentally in early childhood is really, and what's sort of available for work is really those core cognitive skills. And they're tied to a set of important emotion skills, but they're really active. And so we separate them in order to get folks organized around precision and simplification in their focus. So the work of Vygotsky is all through all of this. But when we get to the translational part, where we try and sort of distill for others, we have to oversimplify often.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really useful to separate them for analytical purposes, because it's very hard to analyze data. For example, I'm using qualitative data, narrative data, and this is very hard when emotional and cognitive go together. So
yes,
it is, yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
If maybe I can ask, use my position as moderator. I have a set of pragmatic questions. Well, the first question is, would it be easy to adapt the interventions that you use to Russian context? And would you be actually interested in testing the adaptation here?
The second question first, yes. We would be interested. The first question is maybe. So about adaptation. We have taken our intervention strategies in a number of projects and contextualize them, meaning we spend time in a new setting and we ask stakeholders, so teachers and parents and school administrators and policymakers, about the language that they use to characterize this area, and then we think about how the interventions should be adapted so that they more accurately reflect the language and the thinking of a place. And we've done this with our kernel interventions in different kinds of settings. One of our primary areas of interest is education in crisis and conflict. And so we have adapted and contextualized many of them for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, for those who are fleeing Boko Haram in Niger, and then in some developing contexts like Brazil. That's not to say that Russia is like that, but that we, in the process, have generated a set of tools for contextualization that allow us to adapt, to keep the core of the intervention, but adapt the parts that are flexible so that it is meaningful and it fits a new context.
Thank you. And another also question. I understand right that some of them are relatively, could you maybe make an example of intervention just to, and maybe an example of the easiest kind of to implement intervention, so we understand, because my understanding was, but I'm not sure if it's correct, that because this field is relatively new and we know not so many, that there may be some very easy to implement intervention, but they work well, because like probably in academic performance this is not true because we do so much, but this is it true or not, that there is something?
So I think it depends on the target, right? So it depends on the outcome. But my hypothesis in the field is that if we believe the evidence that says that all of these programs, this is the list. If these are effective, like we believe believe they're effective, we believe the science that says that they make a difference. If we believe that, and we, at the same time, don't have information about the data piñata. So we don't know what the mechanisms are that account for the effectiveness of these programs. We just know on average that they're effective. And it's complicated. The science, especially in the real world, the science of deconstructing interventions like this is complicated to do. Our theory is that it is likely that the elements that are common across all of these are what account for their effectiveness. So for example, every single of the 25 programs that we reviewed has a routine for physiological regulation. Every one of them. They all have them. That tells me that there's something very important about supporting young people to learn how to regulate their body and their brain when faced with something that is challenging. And that is likely, just the use of that strategy is likely one of the reasons that these are effective programs. So, and if you look at routines for physiological regulation, they're very simple. Stop, think, calm down, and do something. They all have those three components. They're very simple. They're easy to do. In each program, they look different, they have a different character, they use different words, but their essence is the same. And that's a really simple strategy that if every teacher learned it, or every parent learned it and was using it with the kids in their care, with the children in their care, we'd probably have something that generates the effects of these programs alone, because it might be the key ingredient, or one of them, and it's easier to do a lot of the time. If it's wrapped up in something complicated, a complicated lesson, a scope and sequence, people don't do it. They forget it because there's so much other stuff to think about and do. So I think that there are probably 10 or 12 core practices like that would be very easy to do and support teachers to do in a regular way. They would choose when to do them, when they needed them, but I think they're probably 10 to 12. In our Kernel's grant, we are working with 43 kernel strategies that we've identified. And we expect that once we finish our piloting and our trial, we'll learn that teachers only choose a small set of them to implement in their classrooms. And those will be the ones that are high levers for distilling and sharing and trying.
Thank you very much for. That was exactly what I was asking. And this is work in. So this is work in progress. Right now, we don't know. This is work in progress, right?
Yeah, we know some things.
Yeah,
we don't know everything, but we never will. So that's okay.
So maybe more questions? No. Well, also the time is actually up.
It's overtime, probably.
Yes. So I think I suggest to thank both speakers again. And I think you can probably talk, right? With both, you are staying here for some time. So if anyone wants to.